The Age of Revolutions in Europe and the Americas. The list on your screen represents new words that describe the social world post-1765, during which the world became increasingly urbanized. Workers moved to cities. Conditions of filth, disease, and hunger often led to violent protest. Orators denounced tyranny and demanded new rights and freedoms. The term ordinary man was largely inspired by Napoleon, who was an ordinary soldier that rose to conquer most of Europe. So at this point, the ordinary man could reach above his underdog status and change his station in life. The Industrial Revolution began in England, and other nations emulated English innovations as its commercial and military power imperialized vast portions of the world. Landowners lost legal control over serfs in Russia, and farmers in Europe developed new entrepreneurial roles for themselves as the peasantry working for them acquired more autonomy or moved into factory labor in the textile industry, which was often worse for their health and pockets. Colonialism allowed for market development, both in gathering new resources from territories that were conquered and in procuring goods from those lands to sell in Europe. Cotton was the primary product, harvested by slaves and shipped to textile factories in England. Revolutionaries in France and America argued that ordinary people should take political decision-making into their own hands. In North America, colonial subjects were resentful of the English king, whose politics and economic policies led the American colonies to declare independence in 1776, not only from English rule, but also from the practice of hereditary monarchy, and to instead favor an elected president with power vested in the people. The idea of democracy, that the general will of the people shaped politics more than an individual's will, evolved from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's writing. The image you see is a bust of Jean-Jacques Rousseau by Jean-Antoine Houdon. French people also rejected an absolute monarchy, with peasants rejecting the excessive tithes and taxes they paid during periods when harvests were low and bread's cost was doubled. On July 14, 1789, peasants stormed the Bastille, a symbol of royal power, and demanded liberation. The French National Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which asserted equality and freedom of all men and abolished the notion of aristocratic and hereditary privilege, separating church and state, abolishing slavery in the colonies, and granting equal rights to everyone, including, for the first time, Jews. Weakened by civil revolt and by wars with neighboring European countries, who feared that French revolutionary sentiments were contagious, French rule was seized by the radical Jacobins, who established a centralized dictatorship and mass executed groups of people suspected of treason. The period was known as the Reign of Terror for the ruthlessness and extremism of this new government, which eventually ceased and was replaced in 1790 with a new dictator, Napoleon. What you see on the screen is the execution of French King Louis XIV, an engraving by Georg Heinrich Seveking from 1793. In 1799, Napoleon established a new dictatorship in France, reinstated slavery, and crowned himself emperor in 1804. Prior to this event, the Pope crowned kings and emperors, now showing that divine right and hereditary monarchy under God's will were irrelevant. After numerous failed attempts at world conquest, Napoleon was defeated by the British at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Napoleon famously established the Napoleonic Code, a new legal system modeled after that of ancient Rome. It abolished hereditary principles, promoted employment based on skill rather than social connection or status, and established freedom of religion. Napoleon directly influenced South American countries to gain independence from Spanish rule. The image you see is Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, by Charles Auguste Steuben. Most artists' portrayals of Napoleon, even in defeat, as here, where he is shown during the Battle of Waterloo, reinforced a romanticized heroic ideal. Workers who had been exploited mobilized, organizing strikes and protests against economic and political inequalities. They called themselves the proletariat, or the working class, for the first time. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto, which ended with "Workers of the world, unite." These words inspired change internationally. The image you see depicts Karl Marx at work. 1848 marked a period of international revolutions in France, Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, Spain, Germany, Italy, Denmark, and Romania. The French abolished slavery permanently in this year, and women's rights activists in the United States organized their first convention at Seneca Falls. The image you see here is by Nicolas-André Monsiau, which shows the revolution of the French colonies. Revolutionary writers. Here you see a list of revolutionary writers. Much of Blake's non-esoteric poetry exposes church and government corruption and demands fair labor rights for women and children. Hines supported the workers' uprising stemming from economic and political inequality, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning used poetry to persuade contemporaries to limit child labor in factories. Bellow, the artistic liberator, inspired Latin Americans to use their own themes and ideas in writing, and Marty established himself as a national poet, revolutionary fighter, and political prisoner. Burke reflected on the vagaries of the French Revolution, while Wordsworth and Coleridge collaborated on the lyrical ballads, which reflected the language of the common man. Dickens, in The Tale of Two Cities, 1859, exposed poverty in England and France, as did Hugo, whose work in French poetry, novels, and theater represents a quintessential romanticism heralded by the French Revolution. Shelley saw modernity in the French Revolution, while Tolstoy and Melville set their respective novels, War and Peace and Billy Budd, in Napoleonic history. Artists increasingly created art for the people, rather than for the didactic purpose or under the patronage of an aristocrat. This map depicts one of the most unfortunate and devastating periods in human history. The transatlantic slave trade between Europe, whose industries and wealth depended on slave labor, Africa, the source of some 12 million slave laborers, as indicated centrally on the map, and the New World, including North, South, and Central America, and the Caribbean, where slaves were put to work on sugar plantations, in mines, and in the fields. The sheer number of people captured and sold into slavery is staggering in total, but equally horrifying is how many millions of slaves were traded under the auspices of individual European powers, including Great Britain and Portugal. Slaves were transported across the Atlantic like so much cargo. Profits could be maximized by transporting as many slaves as a ship would hold. Once they arrived from Africa, slaves were sold to owners at slave markets. Many writers, both European and non-European alike, voiced their outrage and argued to abolish the slave trade. British Parliament finally passed the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. The American and French revolutions had an immediate impact for those living through them, but each also had a long-lasting effect, inspiring people across the globe with the possibility of democratic equality. Such revolutionary ideals are never easy to achieve, nor do the realities of the revolutionary spirit always live up to the dream. But by the mid-19th century, the world was full of places where social change was happening in a profound way. This map shows major revolutionary centers in Europe in 1848, a year that came to be known as the Springtime of the Peoples. Revolutions were happening in Lisbon, in Portugal, to Ireland in the United Kingdom, to Budapest in Hungary. It seemed that everywhere the working class was rising up to fight for their equality and for what they saw as a fair share of the wealth and power that their hard work made possible. Workers of the world unite, wrote Marx and Engels in their Communist Manifesto, a rallying cry heard around the world. The word revolution comes from the Latin revolvere, to turn. Once associated with astronomy, in the 18th century it came to refer to a total overthrow of existing political and social order. Important revolutions of the period include the American, French, and Latin American independence movements. Revolutionary leaders were set to the difficult task of answering questions about relationships between governments and those governed, about how to treat ordinary life and political institutions, and about the laws a just society requires. Written by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence draws on principles of Enlightenment philosophers, including inalienable natural rights granted by God to all humans, and that governments are not entitled to impose their will arbitrarily, but instead derive their power from the consent of those they govern. It was passed by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia on July 4, 1776. The image you see is a facsimile of the original draft of the United States Declaration of Independence, with images of the signers around the border. After the storming of the Bastille prison in Paris on July 14, 1789, leaders of the French Revolution agreed that it was necessary to draw up a Declaration of Rights, and decided upon something easy to read and disseminate. The French National Assembly passed it on August 26, 1789, asserting natural human rights. The image is a watercolor of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, 1793. Olympe de Gouges was the daughter of a rural butcher, but reinvented herself as a playwright and Parisian intellectual. She proposed the abolition of slavery and rights of orphans and unwed mothers. The Rights of Woman, 1791, insists that the rights of freedom and equality granted under the French Revolution must be extended to women. She was guillotined in 1793 during the Reign of Terror due to her radical language. The image you see is a portrait of de Gouges, 18th century, by Alexander Kucharski. Burke was an Anglo-Irish politician who responded conservatively to his people's enthusiasm of the French Revolution. He supported tradition for the sake of stability and freedom, which upheld monarchy and the inheritance of wealth and political power, and avoided the type of mob mentality that disrupts institutions and generates only chaos. The image you see is of Edmund Burke by Antoine Louis-François Sargent-Marceau. As the French Revolution abolished old hierarchies, the people of Saint-Dominique, the jewel of the French Empire, debated questions about natural rights, especially freedom and equality. In 1791, the slaves who made up the majority of the island rose up under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture and launched a decade-long war. Louverture joined the French Republic to defeat the British and Spanish after the French officially liberated the slaves. But after Napoleon had him arrested, his second-in-command, Dessalines, took charge. He defeated French troops in 1803 and proclaimed the new nation of Haiti. The image you see is a painting showing military action led by Dessalines during the Haitian Revolution. Wordsworth's autobiographic poem, The Prelude, reveals his elation and horror at the bloody revolution entering the Reign of Terror that he witnessed when living in France from 1790 to 92. In 1802, Wordsworth also published a poem to the Haitian revolutionary Toussaint Louverture. The image shows a selection from the sonnets of William Wordsworth. Known as El Libertador, Simón Bolívar led the movement for Latin American independence from Spain. In 1819, Bolívar's army beat back Spanish forces, liberating the Republic of Colombia, where he was elected president. His letter from Jamaica offers a theory of colonial power and states it would be beneficial for both Latin Americans and Europeans to give Latin Americans independence. The image you see is a stereographic view of a statue of Simón Bolívar by R. de la Cora. After they were forbidden to speak at the World Anti-Slavery Convention of 1840, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton created the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, demanding whether or not it was practical for the new women's movement to demand the right to vote. This image is a photograph of Stanton who's seated and Susan B. Anthony from about 1900. So let's test your knowledge. Which good was initially responsible for England's industrial boom? Grain, whiskey, corn, or cotton? Please pause the video and make your selection. Cotton, the basis of the textile industry, was the primary, though not the only good that drove the Industrial Revolution. Who declared independence in 1776? Britain, France, the United States, or all of the above? Pause the video and make your selection. In 1776, the English colonists in North America declared their independence from British rule. What event marked the beginning of the French Revolution? The storming of the Bastille, the invasion of France by the British, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the execution of the French king. Pause the video and make your selection. In 1789, storming of the Bastille, a French prison that was a symbol of monarch power, marked the beginning of the French Revolution. In what work can you find this typically revolutionary expression? Workers of the world unite. The Napoleonic Code, the Declaration of Rights of Man, the Declaration of Independence, or the Communist Manifesto. Pause the video and make your selection. Workers of the World Unite is from Marx and Engels' 1848 Communist Manifesto. The expression reflects how the spirit of the revolution had permeated cultures around the globe, and how workers, the basis of the Industrial Revolution itself, though also its longtime victims, were arguing for equality. In 1798, who authorized a work that was to break the poetic tradition by employing language really used by men? William Blake, William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Leo Tolstoy. Pause the video and make your selection. In 1798, Wordsworth and Coleridge collaborated on a volume of poetry entitled Lyrical Ballads. In the preface to that work, Wordsworth and Coleridge expressed their intentions to develop a new kind of poetry, one that featured language really used by men. The explicitly revolutionary character of the preface and of Wordsworth and Coleridge's poetic aims and ideals reflects the grander revolutionary spirit of the age. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Bye.